They smirked when Master Sergeant James Atlas Rhodes entered the prestigious National Canine Excellence Competition with his battle-scarred German Shepherd. The whispers cut through the air like shrapnel as he limped across the polished floor. In his faded combat boots and service medal-adorned jacket. "Is that even a certified service dog?" someone muttered. "More like a military washout," another replied. Little did they know that this man and his extraordinary dog would soon silence every critic in the room, revealing a bond forged in warfare that would change how the world understood loyalty and healing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gleaming exhibition center in Westbrook stood in stark contrast to the dusty pickup truck that pulled into the far corner of the parking lot. The vehicle's military veteran plates were barely visible beneath a layer of road grime, and the once green paint had faded to a dull patina that spoke of years spent under unforgiving desert suns. Inside the cab, Master Sergeant James Rhodes gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. A deep breath escaped him as he surveyed the sea of luxury SUVs and specialized dog transport vans that surrounded his modest truck. "What do you think, Shadow?" he asked, glancing at the German Shepherd sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat. "Not exactly our usual terrain." The dog's amber eyes met his with unwavering focus. Unlike the meticulously groomed show, dogs being unloaded from climate-controlled vehicles nearby, Shadow's coat bore the subtle marks of a working animal. A jagged scar ran along his left flank, and his right ear showed the telltale nick of a close encounter with something far more dangerous than a grooming scissors. James ran his hand over his own scars unconsciously, the ones visible on his forearm and the ones hidden beneath his prosthetic leg. 3 years had passed since the IED that had taken his lower left leg and nearly his life. 3 years since Shadow had dragged him to safety under heavy fire, ignoring his own injuries to save his handler. "Registration closes in 20 minutes, James muttered, checking his watch, an old, reliable military-issue timepiece that had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan. With deliberate movements, he opened the door and swung his prosthetic leg out first, a habit formed through months of physical therapy. Shadow jumped down beside him, immediately taking up position at James's left side, the side with the prosthetic, without command or leash. The dog maintained perfect heel position, his body just close enough to offer support if James's gait faltered on the uneven pavement. "Master Sergeant Rhodes?" The voice came from a young woman approaching them with a tablet in hand. Her pressed blazer and immaculate appearance belonged to the world of the exhibition center, not the battlefield, where James had spent the past decade. "That's me," James confirmed, straightening to his full height out of instinct, military bearing, evident despite his civilian clothes. "I'm Eliza Montgomery, coordinator for the Service Dog Exhibition category." Her smile faltered slightly as she took in James's weathered appearance and Shadow's battle-marked body. "We were surprised to receive your application. Most of our participants come through established service dog organizations." James nodded once, his expression neutral. "Shadow isn't a standard service dog. We served together in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He's a retired military working dog." Eliza's eyes widened slightly. "I see. And your qualification?" The hesitation in her voice made it clear she was uncomfortable asking a man in his condition to justify his need for a service animal. "Left leg below the knee. TBI. PTSD. James delivered the abbreviations with military efficiency. "Shadow assists with mobility, balance, and psychological symptoms." She nodded, making notes on her tablet. The exhibition category is quite competitive this year. We have teams from the nation's top service dog training facilities. Her eyes flickered to Shadow again. Your paperwork mentioned he lacks formal service dog certification. Shadow has more field experience than any certified dog in that building, James replied evenly. But if that's an issue— No, Eliza quickly interjected. The exhibition category allows for unconventional partnerships. I just want to prepare you. The judges and audience expect a certain level of polish. James kept his expression neutral, though the familiar tightening in his chest had begun, the precursor to the anxiety that had become his unwelcome companion since returning home. Shadow immediately pressed closer against his leg, the pressure a silent reminder of his presence. We're not here for polish, James said simply. We're here to show what's possible when two warriors help each other heal. Eliza seemed uncertain how to respond to that. Well, let me show you to your assigned area. The exhibition doesn't begin until tomorrow, but you can get settled and familiarize Shadow with the environment. As they walked toward the enormous glass doors of the exhibition center, James couldn't help but notice how people's eyes slid past him to focus on Shadow, not with the admiration typically afforded to service animals, but with the critical assessment of those looking for flaws. Inside, the contrast was even more pronounced. The main atrium bustled with activity as handlers in crisp uniforms guided impeccably groomed dogs through practice routines. Corporate sponsors had set up elaborate displays showcasing premium dog food, cutting-edge training equipment, and the latest in service dog technology. Everything gleamed with an antiseptic perfection that felt foreign to James after years in dust-covered forward operating bases. The exhibition participants are in the East Wing, Eliza explained, leading them. Past the main show floor, you'll be in stall 44. As they passed through the main exhibition area, conversations quieted and heads turned. James kept his gaze forward. The same disciplined focus that had carried him through enemy territory, now deployed against the discomfort of being scrutinized. James Rhodes, is that you? The voice cut through the hushed whispers, commanding and familiar. James turned to see William Hastings approaching, surrounded by an entourage of handlers and assistants. Hastings' Canine Academy was emblazoned across their matching polo shirts, and at Hastings' side walked a perfectly groomed German Shepherd wearing a vest covered in certification patches and competition medals. Hastings? James acknowledged with a nod. They had known each other before. Hastings had been a military dog trainer before founding his now famous academy that supplied service dogs to celebrities and wealthy clients. I heard a rumor you'd entered, Hastings said, his smile not reaching his eyes as he surveyed James and Shadow. Didn't quite believe it. How long has it been? 3 years since your early retirement. The choice of words wasn't accidental. James knew Hastings was well aware of the circumstances of his medical discharge. About that, James replied simply. Hastings' attention shifted to Shadow, his expression becoming more critical. And this is your service dog? The slight emphasis carried clear meaning. Interesting choice to bring a military working dog into the service world. They're trained for aggression, not assistance. Different skill sets entirely. Before James could respond, a small crowd had gathered around them, drawn by Hastings' prestige in the dog training world. Shadow adapted, James said evenly. He figured out what I needed. Hastings gave a theatrical laugh. Dogs don't figure out complex service tasks, James. They're trained systematically through proven protocols. He gestured to his own dog. Apollo here underwent 2 years of specialized training with 14 different trainers to achieve his certification. The investment for a proper service dog exceeds $50,000. The onlookers nodded in agreement, several casting doubtful glances at Shadow, who remained perfectly positioned at James's side, his attention divided between monitoring his handler and scanning the environment, a habit from his military days. "Shadow and I have our own methods," James replied, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest increasing despite his outward calm. Hastings placed a hand on James's shoulder in a gesture that appeared friendly but felt condescending. "Look, I respect your service, I really do, but this competition showcases the gold standard in service dog training. These animals represent years of careful breeding and methodical training. It might be uncomfortable for you to see the contrast tomorrow." The implication was clear. James and Shadow didn't belong here. Sensing the spike in James's heart rate, Shadow pressed more firmly against his leg, applying precise pressure. That helped ground him in the present moment. The dog's action wasn't lost on Hastings, whose confident expression faltered slightly. "Interesting behavior," he commented, studying Shadow more intently. "Not standard service dog protocol." "Like I said," James replied, his voice steadier than he felt, "we have our own methods." Eliza, who had been watching the exchange uncomfortably, stepped forward. "We should continue to your assigned area, Sergeant Rhodes. You'll want time to settle in before the facility closes for the evening." With a curt nod to Hastings, James followed Eliza away from the gathering, aware of the whispers that trailed behind them. Shadow remained glued to his side, his body language relaxed, but alert. Stall 44 proved to be in the farthest corner of the exhibition space, far from the premium positions given to established service dog organizations. Unlike the elaborate setups with custom banners and specialized equipment, Stall 44 offered only the basics: a small space with a bench, water bowl, and area for Shadow to rest. "The exhibition begins at 10 a.m. tomorrow," Eliza explained, her tone gentler now. "Each team has 12 minutes to demonstrate their service capabilities. The judges will be looking for task performance, handler interaction, and public behavior." "Standards?" James nodded, taking in the information as he surveyed the space with a tactical eye. Old habits from deployments that had kept him alive in hostile territory. "Is there anything else you need?" Eliza asked, genuine concern finally breaking through her professional veneer. "We're good," James assured her. "We've managed with a lot less." After Eliza left, James settled on the bench, his prosthetic leg aching from the prolonged standing. Shadow immediately lay across his feet, providing the weight and pressure that helped ease both physical pain and anxiety. "Not exactly a warm welcome," James murmured, running his hand through Shadow's thick fur. The dog looked up at him with calm, steadfast eyes that seemed to say, "We've faced worse," and they had, much worse. 3 years earlier, Master Sergeant James Rhodes had been leading a night patrol near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Shadow, then at the peak of his career as a multi-purpose canine, had been working ahead of the patrol, searching for explosives and enemy combatants. The mission had been straightforward: gather intelligence on suspected Taliban movements in the area. James and Shadow had completed dozens of similar operations, their partnership honed to near telepathic precision through years of working together in the most dangerous regions of the conflict. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They had been approaching a small compound when Shadow's behavior changed subtly, not the alert that indicated explosives or enemies, but something different, a hesitation James had never seen before. Trusting his dog's instincts, James had signaled the patrol to hold position while he and Shadow investigated. That moment of trust had saved the lives of his entire 12-man team. The IED that detonated had been of a new design, undetectable by standard methods. James took the brunt of the blast, the explosion throwing him 20 feet and shredding his left leg below the knee. In the chaotic aftermath, as insurgents opened fire from hidden positions, Shadow had dragged his unconscious handler to shelter. Despite sustaining shrapnel wounds himself, what happened next had become legend in their unit. Shadow, bleeding from multiple wounds, had left the relative safety of their position to alert the rest of the team to the ambush, then returned to defend his unconscious handler, keeping insurgents at bay until help arrived. James's next clear memory was waking in a military hospital in Germany. Shadow somehow curled at the foot of his bed, despite regulations prohibiting it. The dog had refused to leave his side, growling at anyone who tried to separate them, until the hospital staff relented and allowed the extraordinary animal to stay. The road to recovery had been brutal. Multiple surgeries on his leg, traumatic brain injury that left him with persistent headaches and memory issues, and the psychological weight of PTSD that made civilian life seem insurmountable. Through it all, Shadow had remained his constant, adapting to each new challenge without formal training. When nightmares jolted James awake, Shadow was there, lying across his chest with gentle, grounding pressure. When balance failed him as he learned to use his prosthetic, Shadow appeared at his side, offering his solid frame for support. When crowds and noise triggered anxiety, Shadow created space, placing himself between James and others with quiet authority. None of these behaviors had been formally trained. Shadow had simply observed, adapted, and responded to James's needs with an intelligence and intuition that defied conventional understanding of canine capabilities. The military had been prepared to retire Shadow and place him for adoption, standard procedure for a working dog whose handler could no longer serve. But the bond between them had been too profound to break. After months of petitioning and support from their former unit, James had been allowed to adopt Shadow, bringing him home to civilian life. Now, sitting in the corner of a glossy exhibition center surrounded by professionally trained service dogs with pedigrees and certifications, James wondered if coming here had been a mistake. They didn't belong in this world of polished perfection and rigid protocols. His thoughts were interrupted by a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, who approached their stall cautiously. She wore leg braces and used forearm crutches, a service dog vest visible on the golden retriever at her side. "Is your dog a hero?" she asked without preamble, her eyes wide as she looked at Shadow. James was taken aback by the direct question. "What makes you ask that?" She pointed to the scar on Shadow's flank. "My dog Sonny doesn't have any scars, but my dad says scars mean you survived something tough, and your dog looks like he survived something really tough." The simple observation, delivered with a child's straightforward perception, caught James off guard. He found himself smiling, the first genuine smile since arriving at the exhibition. "Yeah, he's a hero," James confirmed. "His name is Shadow, and we served in Afghanistan together. He saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers." The girl's eyes widened further. "He was in the army." "He was," James nodded. "He's retired now, just like me." "Can I pet him?" she asked. "Or is he working?" James glanced at Shadow, who was watching the interaction calmly. "He's always working in a way, but yes, you can pet him if you'd like. Shadow, say hello." At the command, Shadow rose and approached the girl gently, his demeanor shifting subtly from alert guardian to friendly companion. He sat patiently while she stroked his head, his eyes still occasionally checking James for signals. "He feels different from Sonny," the girl observed. "Stronger." "He is strong," James agreed. "He had to be for the work we did." "Hannah!" A woman's voice called out, concern evident in her tone. A moment later, the girl's mother appeared, her face apologetic. "I'm so sorry if she's bothering you." "She's no bother at all," James assured her. The woman seemed about to lead her daughter away when she noticed James's prosthetic leg partially visible beneath his pant leg. Recognition dawned in her eyes. "You're military." "Was," James corrected gently. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her expression softened. "My brother served with the 10th Mountain Division, Afghanistan, 2014. An understanding passed between them, the unspoken recognition of shared sacrifice that civilians couldn't fully comprehend. "Hannah's always been drawn to service dogs," the woman explained. "Sunny helps her with mobility and balance issues from her cerebral palsy. We're here for the Junior Handler exhibition tomorrow." "We're in the service dog exhibition," James replied. "First time." The woman looked at Shadow with new appreciation. "Military working dog?" "The best," James confirmed, a note of pride entering his voice. "It didn't come through traditional service dog channels, though." She smiled knowingly. "The best ones rarely do. Sometimes I think these dogs choose their path, not the other way around." She extended her hand. "I'm Rebecca, by the way. Rebecca Tanner." "James Rhodes," he replied, shaking her hand. "And this is Shadow. Well, James and Shadow will be cheering for you tomorrow." She gave a gentle tug on her daughter's sleeve. "Come on, Hannah. We need to let Mr. Rhodes and Shadow rest before their big day." Hannah gave Shadow one final pat. "Good luck, hero." "Dog," she whispered before following her mother. The brief interaction left James feeling more centered than he had since arriving. The genuine appreciation from Hannah and the understanding from Rebecca stood in stark contrast to the skeptical assessment from the professional dog world. As evening approached, the exhibition hall gradually emptied of staff and competitors. James had been given permission to stay overnight with Shadow, rather than leaving him in the assigned kennel area, a small courtesy extended after Eliza learned of their military background. In the quiet of the nearly empty building, James unrolled a sleeping bag beside Shadow's bed. The familiar routine of preparing a sparse sleeping area brought back memories of forward operating bases and remote outposts. In some ways, it was more comfortable than the soft beds he still struggled to sleep in at home. "What do you think, boy?" James asked quietly, sitting on the floor next to Shadow. "Are we out of our league here?" Shadow shifted to rest his head on James's lap, amber eyes looking up with unwavering focus. "Yeah, I know. Doesn't matter what they think. We know what we can do." As he stroked Shadow's fur, James's thoughts turned to the next day's exhibition. Hastings and his perfectly trained Apollo would undoubtedly deliver a flawless performance of textbook service dog tasks. The other professional teams would showcase precision training and standardized responses to commands. Shadow's assistance wasn't about commands and protocols. It was about intuition, adaptation, and the profound connection between two beings who had faced death together. How could they demonstrate that in a 12-minute performance for judges who expected technical perfection? The anxiety that always lingered beneath the surface began to rise again, bringing with it the phantom sensations that sometimes accompanied it. The feeling of heat and pressure from the explosion, the smell of dust and blood, the disorienting confusion of traumatic brain injury. Shadow recognized the signs immediately. Without prompting, he moved to lie across James's legs, applying firm, steady pressure that helped interrupt the spiral of anxiety. The weight was grounding, pulling James back from the edge of memory to the present moment. "Good boy," James murmured, his breathing gradually steadying under Shadow's watchful gaze. "Always on duty, aren't you?" As they settled for the night, James made a decision. They wouldn't try to mimic the polished routines of the professional teams tomorrow. Instead, they would show something real, the authentic partnership that had carried them through warfare and recovery, through darkness and pain. to the healing bond they now shared. Let the judges and spectators think what they would. James and Shadow had survived much worse than judgment. Morning arrived with the bustle of staff and competitors returning to the exhibition center. James awoke at dawn from habit, years of military discipline making early rising automatic. Shadow was already alert, watching the increasing activity through the stall opening with calm assessment. James quickly went through his morning routine, including the sometimes frustrating process of donning his prosthetic. Shadow stayed close, occasionally steadying him with his body when James's balance wavered. "Master Sergeant Rhodes?" A timid voice called from outside the stall. "I've brought you the exhibition schedule and some coffee." It was Eliza, the coordinator from yesterday, holding a steaming cup and several papers. Her expression was gentler than it had been during their first meeting. "Thank you," James said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You're scheduled fourth in the lineup," she explained, handing him the schedule. 10-minute warning before your slot. You'll have 12 minutes for your demonstration." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I wasn't as welcoming as I should have been." James shook his head. "No apology needed. We're not what you typically see in these events." "That's just it," Eliza said, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine emotion. "My cousin came back from Iraq 3 years ago. He's struggled, seeing you here doing this." She trailed off, collecting herself. "Just know that not everyone is judging you the way some of the professional handlers might be." The unexpected support caught James off guard. "Thank you," he said simply. As Eliza left, James reviewed the schedule. Hastings and Apollo were slotted first, prime positioning that would set the standard for all who followed. 2 other professional teams would perform next, then James and Shadow, followed by 6 more competitors. The exhibition hall was filling rapidly as spectators arrived for the day's events. From their corner stall, James could hear the growing crowd, the announcements over the PA system, the controlled chaos of a major competition getting underway. Shadow remained calm beside him, but James noticed the subtle changes in his posture. Slightly more alert, ears moving more actively to track sounds, his body positioning shifting to maintain optimal awareness of his surroundings. These were the same adaptations he'd made in crowded Afghan marketplaces where threats might emerge from any direction. "Easy, boy," James murmured. "Different battlefield today." They left their stall to walk the perimeter of the exhibition area, part of their preparation routine. Shadow maintained perfect heel position on James's left side, providing subtle support whenever the prosthetic caught slightly on the polished floor. His presence created a natural buffer between James and the crowds, maintaining the personal space that helped keep anxiety at bay. As they rounded a corner, they encountered Hastings and his team, making final preparations for their performance. Apollo sat in perfect position, his vest spotless, every hair in place. 2 assistants fussed over details while Hastings spoke. With what appeared to be sponsors or VIPs, Hastings spotted them and broke away from his conversation. "James, glad you made it. Sleep well in the stall?" The question carried a hint of condescension. "Like a rock," James replied evenly. "Military habit." Hastings studied Shadow with a professional eye. "No vest?" he asked, noting Shadow's simple leather collar and the absence of the patches and insignia that adorned most service dogs. "Don't need one. People generally understand when they see this." James gestured subtly to his prosthetic leg. Hastings shook his head slightly. "Presentation matters in this world, James. The judges will be looking for professional standards. The audience expects a certain image from service animals." He adjusted Apollo's already perfect vest. "But I suppose you're just in the exhibition category. Lower stakes." Before James could respond, the announcement came for Hastings to proceed to the staging area. With a final adjustment to his own impeccable attire, Hastings led Apollo away, his team falling in behind him like a well-oiled machine. James and Shadow continued their circuit, eventually finding a quieter spot where they could observe the exhibition ring while maintaining some distance from the crowd. From this vantage point, they watched as Hastings and Apollo entered to enthusiastic applause. Even James had to admire the technical perfection of their performance. Apollo responded to subtle hand signals and whispered commands, demonstrating textbook service dog tasks, retrieving dropped items, opening doors, providing counterbalance, alerting to sounds, and performing blocking maneuvers in crowd scenarios, enacted by volunteers. Throughout the demonstration, Hastings narrated with practiced charm, explaining each task and its purpose for different disabilities. The audience responded with appreciative murmurs and regular applause. The judges' expressions showed clear approval as they made notes on their tablets. As Hastings concluded to strong applause, James felt a moment of doubt. How could he and Shadow compete with such polished professionalism? Their partnership, forged in warfare and recovery, didn't translate neatly into the scripted demonstrations this audience expected. The next two competitors delivered similarly impressive performances, though neither quite matched Hastings' level of precision and presentation. The judges maintained their expressions of approval, occasionally nodding, as particularly difficult tasks were executed flawlessly. Master Sergeant Rhodes? Eliza appeared at his side. "You're up in 10 minutes." James nodded, taking a deep breath to center himself. Shadow sensed the subtle shift in his energy, pressing closer against his leg in response. "Remember," Eliza said quietly, "just show them what makes your partnership special. That's what the exhibition category is really about." As they made their way to the staging area, James noticed several spectators pointing and whispering as they passed. The military bearing that had been ingrained through years of service kept his spine straight and his gaze forward despite the scrutiny. In the staging area, he could hear the announcer's voice introducing the previous team and the applause that followed their performance. The sound system would carry his introduction next, broadcasting his background to hundreds of strangers. Shadow maintained his position beside James, occasionally looking up to check his handler's status. The intuitive monitoring was one of the many ways Shadow supported him. Constant awareness of James's physical and emotional state, adjusting his own behavior accordingly. "Next in our service dog exhibition," the announcer's voice boomed, "we have a unique partnership. Please welcome Master Sergeant James Rhodes, retired from the 75th Ranger Regiment, and Shadow, a former military working dog who served in Afghanistan. Master Sergeant Rhodes and Shadow are demonstrating how military working dogs can adapt to service dog roles." The introduction complete, James took another steadying breath, looked down at Shadow and said quietly, "Let's show them what real partnership looks like." Together, they walked into the exhibition ring, into the bright lights and the scrutiny of judges and spectators alike, ready to demonstrate a bond that transcended conventional training, a connection forged in fire and tested in the hardest circumstances imaginable. This wasn't just another competition. This was their chance to show the world that sometimes the deepest healing comes from the most unexpected sources. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll see how James and Shadow's performance unfolds and the reaction that leaves the entire audience speechless. The exhibition ring fell silent as Master Sergeant James Rhodes and Shadow stepped into the spotlight. The stark contrast between their appearance and the polished teams that had performed before them was immediately apparent. James wore no uniform, just simple khaki pants and a button-up shirt that did little to hide the prosthetic leg beneath. Shadow bore no vest emblazoned with patches and certifications, only his military-issue tactical collar, the subtle marks of his battlefield service evident in his scarred coat. In the front row, William Hastings sat with his entourage, his expression a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. Beside him, the three judges watched intently, their tablets ready to record their assessments. The audience, having been treated to demonstrations of textbook service dog perfection, leaned forward with interest at this unconventional pair. James took position at the center of the ring, Shadow at perfect heel on his left side. Unlike the previous competitors, he carried no props, had arranged no assistants to help demonstrate tasks. The simplicity of their presence stood in stark contrast to the elaborate performances that had preceded them. "Master Sergeant Rhodes," the head judge prompted, "you may begin your demonstration." James nodded once, military precision in the gesture. He scanned the audience briefly, noting the mix of curiosity and doubt in their expressions. Then, focusing solely on the task at hand, he began. "Shadow and I served together in the 75th Ranger Regiment, conducting over 200 combat missions in Afghanistan," he stated, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed arena. 3 years ago, an IED detonated during a patrol. I lost my left leg below the knee and sustained traumatic brain injury. Shadow suffered shrapnel wounds while dragging me to safety under enemy fire." A murmur ran through the crowd at this stark introduction. Many had not expected such a direct reference to the realities of warfare in the polished environment of the exhibition. "What you're about to see isn't a rehearsed routine," James continued. "Shadow was never formally trained as a service dog. What he does for me, he figured out himself, adapting his military working dog skills to my needs during recovery." From his seat, Hastings shook his head slightly, the movement catching James's eye. The silent dismissal of Shadow's capabilities was exactly what James had expected. "We'll begin with mobility assistance," James announced. Without verbal command or hand signal, James and Shadow began walking the perimeter of the ring. The audience watched as James deliberately allowed his prosthetic to catch slightly on the floor, creating a momentary imbalance. Instantly, Shadow adjusted position, pressing his body against James's left leg to stabilize him while never breaking stride. They continued around the ring, demonstrating how Shadow anticipated and responded to subtle changes in James's gait, providing support precisely when needed without command. Unlike the rigid positions maintained by traditional service dogs, Shadow's movements were fluid and adaptive, constantly reading James's body language and adjusting accordingly. "Shadow doesn't respond to fixed commands for mobility support," James explained as they walked. "He reads my movement patterns and compensates automatically. This is particularly valuable for TBI patients whose balance issues can be unpredictable." Next, they moved to a chair placed in the center of the ring. James sat down, and Shadow immediately positioned himself across James's feet, applying gentle pressure. The behavior appeared simple, but the judges recognized the therapeutic value of deep pressure stimulation for anxiety and PTSD symptoms. "Pressure therapy," James noted. "Shadow adjusts weight and position based on my stress levels, which he detects through scent changes and micro-expressions." In the audience, Dr. Patricia Meadows, the neuropsychiatrist among the judges, leaned forward with increased interest. The behavior Shadow demonstrated aligned with cutting-edge research on biofeedback and trauma recovery. The demonstration continued with Shadow retrieving dropped items, opening doors, and performing other standard service dog tasks, but always with subtle differences that reflected their unique partnership. Shadow never waited for commands, instead, anticipating James's needs moments before they arose, creating a seamless flow of assistance that appeared almost telepathic. "For the next demonstration," James said, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his shoulders, "I need to explain that Shadow performs trauma response for PTSD episodes. With your permission, I'll simulate the beginning of such an episode to show his intervention techniques." The head judge nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his face. This was departing significantly from the scripted demonstrations they typically evaluated. James moved to an open area of the ring and deliberately began the breathing pattern that typically preceded his panic attacks. His hand drifted to his scar, the unconscious gesture that signaled increasing anxiety. His gaze became slightly unfocused, his posture rigid with tension. Shadow's response was immediate and extraordinary. The German Shepherd moved with decisive purpose, circling to face James directly. Using his body weight, Shadow firmly guided James to a seated position on the floor, then placed his front paws on James's shoulders, a behavior the audience had never seen in a service dog. With gentle but insistent pressure, Shadow established eye contact, holding James's gaze with unwavering focus. The dog's breathing remained deep and measured, an anchor point for James to synchronize with. As James's breathing gradually steadied, Shadow adjusted his position, gradually shifting to lie across James's lap, applying calibrated pressure that visibly helped James regulate his physiological response to stress. The exhibition hall had fallen completely silent. There were no whispers, no rustling of programs, not even the usual clicks of the judges' tablets as they made notes. Every person in the room was transfixed by the profound communication occurring between man and dog. In the front row, Hastings' expression had transformed from skepticism to grudging fascination. Beside him, Dr. Meadows had set aside her tablet, entirely watching with the rapt attention of someone witnessing a breakthrough in her field of study. When James finally rose, Shadow transitioning smoothly back to heel position, the silence persisted for several heartbeats before someone in the back of the room began to applaud. The solitary applause quickly spread, building into thunderous appreciation that filled the exhibition hall. James stood at attention, the habit of military bearing keeping his expression composed despite the unexpected response. Shadow remained, focused solely on him, unmoved by the audience's reaction, his attentiveness to James's well-being his only priority. As the applause finally subsided, the head judge cleared his throat. "Master Sergeant Rhodes, that was remarkable. Would you be willing to explain more about how Shadow developed these responses without formal training?" James nodded, relaxing, slightly at the genuine interest in the judge's tone. "Shadow and I spent every day together during my recovery. He observed the medical staff's interventions during my episodes and began replicating the techniques that worked. The pressure therapy, the guided breathing. He saw what helped and adapted his military working dog skills to this new mission." "But working dogs are trained for detection and protection," one of the other judges noted. "These therapeutic responses are entirely different skill sets." "With respect," James replied, "the core of both is the same: reading human physiology and responding appropriately. In Afghanistan, Shadow could detect minute changes in my stress level that signaled potential threats. Now he uses that same ability to detect the onset of panic or pain." Dr. Meadows spoke up, her professional curiosity evident. "The eye contact behavior is particularly unusual. Service dogs are typically trained to monitor their handlers without direct eye engagement. Shadow uses eye contact deliberately," James explained. "In combat, we relied on eye communication when verbal commands weren't possible. Now he uses that connection to pull me back when flashbacks begin, to anchor me to the present." As James answered the judge's questions, he noticed a disturbance at the entrance to the exhibition ring. Rebecca Tanner was there with her daughter Hannah, the young girl they had met the previous day. Hannah was attempting to move closer, but was being held back by an event staff member enforcing the rule that only competitors and judges were allowed. In the ring during evaluations, James caught Rebecca's eye, noting the urgency in her expression. Something was wrong. "Excuse me," he said to the judges. "I believe there's a situation that requires attention." Without waiting for a response, James and Shadow moved quickly to the ring entrance. As they approached, Hannah's service dog, Sunny, was pulling toward them, clearly agitated, behavior completely at odds with the calm demeanor the golden retriever had displayed the previous day. "What's happening?" James asked Rebecca. "It's my husband," she explained hurriedly. "He's a veteran too, 4th Infantry Division. He was watching your demonstration from the back when he started having a severe panic attack. He's in the men's restroom now, but he's not responding to me, and the medical staff can't get near him. When Hannah said you were military..." James understood immediately. "Where?" Rebecca pointed toward a hallway leading off the main exhibition area. James turned to the head judge. "Sir, I need to respond to an emergency. Shadow and I will return as soon as possible." The judge, recognizing the seriousness in James's voice, nodded his permission. James, Shadow and Rebecca moved quickly through the crowd that had gathered for the exhibition, with Hannah and Sunny following close behind. As they reached the restroom, a small crowd had formed: event staff, medical personnel, and concerned onlookers, all helpless against the sounds of distress coming from inside. "Please give us space," James requested firmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of a senior non-commissioned officer. The crowd reluctantly moved back. "What's his name?" James asked Rebecca. "Michael," she replied, worry etched across her face. "He usually manages his PTSD well, but seeing your demonstration, it brought things back." James nodded in understanding. "Shadow, with me." He approached the restroom door slowly, signaling for the others to stay back. "Michael?" "Master Sergeant, James Rhodes, 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm coming in with my service dog. We're here to help, brother." Using the language of military brotherhood was deliberate, establishing a connection that transcended civilian formalities. James pushed the door open carefully, Shadow moving slightly ahead to assess the situation. Inside, they found Michael Tanner wedged into the corner of the restroom, his back against the wall, eyes unfocused and breathing erratic, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled violently, classic signs of a severe flashback episode. At their entrance, his head snapped up, eyes wild with the disorientation of someone trapped between present reality and traumatic memory. "Stand down, soldier," James said calmly, using the steady command voice that had served him on countless missions. "You're in Westbrook, United States. Today is May 15th, 2023. You're at a dog competition with your wife Rebecca and daughter Hannah. The grounding technique, reminding a person in crisis of their current time, location, and circumstances, was standard protocol for PTSD intervention. James kept his distance, knowing that approaching too quickly could escalate the situation. Michael's gaze darted between James and Shadow, recognition slowly filtering through the haze of panic. "Ranger," he managed, focusing on James's bearing rather than his words. "That's right. 75th Regiment, 3rd Battalion. This is Shadow, my partner. He served with me in Afghanistan." A flicker of coherence showed in Michael's expression at the mention of a fellow service dog. James continued the technique, gradually, introducing familiar elements to help Michael distinguish between past trauma and present reality. "Your daughter Hannah has a service dog too, Sunny, golden retriever, remember?" Michael nodded slightly, his breathing still rapid but less desperate. "Hannah, dog show." "That's right," James confirmed. "You're at the National Canine Excellence Competition with your family. You're safe here." As Michael's awareness began to return, James signaled to Shadow. The German Shepherd approached slowly, his body language deliberately non-threatening. When he reached Michael, Shadow did something unexpected. Instead of Applying pressure therapy as he did for James, he simply lay down beside Michael, creating a physical barrier between the veteran and the door, a protective position that military working dogs sometimes adopted in the field. The tactical positioning wasn't lost on Michael. The familiar behavior of a working dog in protection mode provided a psychological safety that words alone couldn't achieve. His breathing began to slow as he hesitantly reached out to touch Shadow's fur. "Good dog," Michael murmured, the simple action of petting Shadow creating a sensory anchor to the present moment. James maintained his position, continuing to speak in calm, measured tones as Michael gradually returned to full awareness. It took nearly 15 minutes, but eventually Michael's breathing normalized and his posture relaxed from the rigid tension of panic. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally, embarrassment replacing fear in his expression. "Watching you and your dog, it brought back Mosul. I wasn't prepared." "No apologies needed between veterans," James replied simply. "We all carry it differently." When Michael was stable enough to stand, James helped him to his feet. Shadow maintained his protective positioning, moving fluidly to accommodate the changing situation while still providing security. "Can Rebecca and Hannah come in?" James asked. "They're concerned." Michael nodded, straightening his clothing in an attempt to restore dignity after the vulnerable moment. James opened the door slightly, signaling that it was safe for Rebecca to enter. She rushed to her husband's side, relief evident in her tears as she embraced him. Hannah followed more cautiously, Sunny pressing close against her leg as the girl assessed her father's condition with the heightened awareness that children of trauma survivors often develop. "Dad, are you okay now?" Hannah asked, her young voice steady despite her obvious concern. Michael knelt to his daughter's level, making a visible effort to compose himself for her sake. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just had a rough moment. Master Sergeant Rhodes and Shadow helped me through it." Hannah turned to James, her expression solemn. "You helped my dad the way Shadow helps you." "Good." The simple observation, delivered with a child's direct perception, captured the essence of what had just occurred. James nodded, finding himself unexpectedly moved by her understanding. "That's what veterans do," he told her. "We help each other find the way back." As the Tanner family regrouped, James became aware of a commotion outside the restroom. The exhibition judges, along with Eliza and several competition officials, had gathered in the hallway, concern evident in their expressions. "Is everything all right, Master Sergeant?" the head judge asked as James emerged. "Yes, sir," James replied. "Mr. Tanner experienced a PTSD episode, but he's stabilizing now." Dr. Meadows stepped forward, her clinical interest tempered with genuine concern. "That was an extraordinary intervention. Both your approach and your dog's behavior were textbook perfect for trauma response, yet entirely intuitive." Before James could respond, the exhibition hall doors at the end of the hallway burst open, and William Hastings strode toward them, his expression unreadable. Apollo walked perfectly at heel beside him, the German shepherd's behavior a study in trained precision. "What's happening here?" Hastings demanded, his tone suggesting he expected to be informed of any disruption to his event. The head judge briefly explained the situation, emphasizing the successful resolution due to James and Shadow's intervention. Hastings studied James with new intensity, his initial skepticism giving way to professional assessment. "You handled a live PTSD crisis without clinical training." "I handled a fellow veteran in distress," James corrected quietly. "Something any of us would do." Hastings turned his attention to Shadow, who had maintained his vigilant position beside James throughout the conversation. And your dog transitioned from demonstration to actual crisis response without hesitation or additional commands. It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. Shadow doesn't distinguish between training and reality. For him, the mission is always the same: monitor, assess, respond. Something shifted in Hastings' expression, a reluctant recognition of capability that transcended his structured training methodology. He studied Shadow with the critical eye of a professional who had spent decades in canine training, then looked back at the judges. "I believe we've witnessed something significant today," Hastings said finally, "something that challenges conventional wisdom about service dog training." The admission, coming from the industry's most prominent advocate for standardized protocols, carried particular weight. The head judge nodded in agreement. "Master Sergeant Rhodes," the judge said, "would you and Shadow be willing to return to the exhibition ring to complete your evaluation? I believe the audience would appreciate knowing the outcome of this situation." James glanced at the Tanner family. Michael, now fully present and composed, gave him an encouraging nod. "We'll be there," James assured the judge. "Just need a moment." As the officials returned to the exhibition hall, James took a moment to check Shadow, running his hands along the dog's body in a familiar routine that was part health assessment and part mutual reassurance. The German Shepherd remained calm and focused, showing no signs of stress despite the intensity of the past hour. "You did good work today," James told him quietly. "Above and beyond as usual." Shadow's response was to press briefly against James's leg, the gesture conveying more than words ever could between them. When they returned to the exhibition ring minutes later, they found the atmosphere transformed. The audience, which had earlier viewed them with skepticism or curiosity, now greeted their entrance with respectful silence. Word of Shadow's intervention with Michael had spread through the exhibition hall, adding a layer of real-world validation to their earlier demonstration. The head judge welcomed them back, explaining briefly to the audience that James and Shadow had successfully assisted another veteran in crisis, demonstrating in real time the capabilities they had showcased in their exhibition. "We've conferred," the judge announced, "and the panel unanimously agrees that what we've witnessed today represents an exceptional contribution to our understanding of service dog capabilities." He turned to face James and Shadow directly. "Master Sergeant Rhodes, while your demonstration was unconventional by competition standards, it exemplified the highest purpose of service animals, providing intuitive, adaptive support in genuine moments of need." From his seat in the front row, Hastings rose to his feet. The gesture from the competition's most decorated participant prompted others to stand as well. Within moments, the entire audience had risen in a silent standing ovation that acknowledged not just the day's events, but the journey that had brought James and Shadow to this moment. As the applause finally began, washing over them in waves of appreciation, James maintained his military bearing, acknowledging the recognition with a respectful nod. Beside him, Shadow remained focused solely on his handler, unmoved by the audience's reaction, his mission as always complete in the well-being of the man beside him. In that moment of public vindication, James found himself thinking not of the judge's approval or the audience's admiration, but of the countless nights when Shadow's steady presence had been his only anchor to sanity, of dawn patrols in distant mountains when their lives had depended on mutual trust, of hospital rooms and physical therapy sessions where Shadow had adapted his war-fighting skills to the new battle of recovery. The exhibition concluded with the presentation of evaluations. To James's surprise, the judges awarded Shadow a special recognition, not in the traditional competition categories where Apollo and other professionally trained dogs excelled, but a newly created honor, the Valor and Service Adaptation Award, acknowledging Shadow's exceptional transition from battlefield to civilian service. As the crowds began to disperse, Hastings approached them again, this time without his entourage. Apollo walked beside him, impeccable as ever, but Hastings' demeanor had changed, the polished confidence giving way to something more genuine. "I owe you an apology, Rhodes," he said without preamble. "I judged your approach based on standards that weren't designed for what you and Shadow have achieved." James nodded, accepting the apology without comment. "The truth is," Hastings continued, "I've been training service dogs for 15 years, and I've never seen the level of intuitive response Shadow demonstrated today. He hesitated, seeming to struggle with the admission. "It's beyond what our protocols can produce." "Different training for different missions," James replied. "Your dogs excel at what they're trained to do. Shadow adapted to what needed to be done." Hastings studied Shadow thoughtfully. "Have you considered how your methods might benefit other veterans? There are thousands of soldiers coming home with PTSD, TBI, physical injuries, and not enough properly trained service dogs to go around." The question caught James off guard. Since his medical retirement, he had focused solely on his own recovery, on rebuilding a life with Shadow's assistance. The idea of extending that experience to help others hadn't occurred to him. "I'm not a dog trainer," James pointed out. "No," Hastings agreed, "but you understand what these veterans need in a way no civilian trainer ever could. And Shadow—" He gestured to the German shepherd, who watched the conversation with alert interest. "Shadow demonstrates capabilities that challenge our entire training paradigm." Before James could respond, they were approached by Dr. Meadows, the neuropsychiatrist from the judging panel. "Master Sergeant Rhodes," she began, professional interest evident in her tone, "I work with the Veterans Administration's PTSD treatment program. What I observed today with Shadow, both in your demonstration and with Mr. Tanner, aligns with emerging research on intuitive response therapy for trauma survivors." James listened as Dr. Meadows explained her work, clinical trials using service dogs for veterans with combat-related PTSD, research that showed promising results but struggled with the lengthy training times required for traditional service dog preparation. "The typical wait time for a veteran to receive a properly trained service dog is 18 to 24 months, she explained. During that critical period, many veterans struggle with isolation, medication dependency, and suicidal ideation. The statistics were familiar to James. He had lost more friends to suicide after deployment than to enemy action during combat operations. The thought tightened his chest, and Shadow immediately pressed against his leg, sensing the shift in his emotional state. Dr. Meadows noticed the interaction. "That," she said, pointing to Shadow's response, "is exactly what makes your approach so valuable. Shadow's ability to detect subtle physiological changes and respond appropriately without command represents a significant advancement in service dog methodology." Hastings nodded in agreement. "I've been thinking about establishing a new division at my academy, focusing specifically on rapid response training for veteran service dogs, not the traditional 2-year program, but something that builds on the natural intuition some dogs already possess." The conversation continued, expanding to include ideas about how military working dogs transitioning out of service might be repurposed for veteran support, rather than adoption to civilian families. How Shadow's adaptive techniques might be observed and replicated in other handler-dog partnerships. How James's first-hand experience of both combat trauma and recovery with canine assistance provided insights that no amount of clinical training could replicate. As they talked, James became aware of a growing sense of purpose, something he had lost when his military career ended abruptly 3 years earlier. The possibility of helping other veterans, of shortening their path through the darkness he had navigated with Shadow's help, resonated deeply. Later that evening, as James and Shadow prepared to leave the exhibition center, they found the Tanner family waiting near their truck. Michael, now fully recovered from his episode, stepped forward to shake James's hand. "I want to thank you properly," he said, his grip firm. "What you did today, what Shadow did, it made a difference." James nodded, recognizing in Michael's eyes the same haunted determination he saw in his own mirror each morning, the daily choice to keep fighting, to reclaim life piece by piece from the trauma that threatened to define it. "Shadow did the heavy lifting," James replied. "He always does." Michael crouched to Shadow's level, meeting the German shepherd's steady gaze. "Thank you for your service, warrior," he said quietly, the simple acknowledgement encompassing both Shadow's battlefield courage and his current mission of healing. Hannah approached next, Sunny at her side. The girl studied James and Shadow with solemn intensity. "Are you going to help other soldiers get dogs like Shadow?" she asked directly. The question, coming from a child's perspective but carrying the weight of her father's struggle, crystallized the decision that had been forming in James's mind throughout the conversations with Hastings and Dr. Meadows. "I think we might," James answered, looking down at Shadow. "What do you think, boy? Ready for a new mission?" Shadow's response was to stand at attention, amber eyes focused and alert, the same readiness he had shown before countless patrols and operations, before each new challenge they had faced together. As the Tanners said their goodbyes, James loaded his modest gear into the truck, Shadow jumping easily into the passenger seat, his established position. Before starting the engine, James took a moment to reflect on the day's events, on the unexpected path that had opened before them. 3 years ago, in the aftermath of catastrophic injury and trauma, he had believed his purpose was finished, his contribution to the world complete. Shadow had been there then, pulling him back from the edge of despair with the same unwavering loyalty he had shown on the battlefield. Now, as they prepared to embark on this new mission, helping other veterans find their way back through the unique bond between handler and dog, James recognized that their journey had never really been about recovery. It had been about rediscovery, about finding new purpose in changed circumstances, about adapting, as Shadow had adapted, to a different kind of service. "Let's go home, Shadow," James said finally, starting the engine. "We've got work to do." As they drove away from the exhibition center, leaving behind the polished world of competition ribbons and perfect performances, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The validation they had received today mattered less than the vision of what might be possible tomorrow, for themselves and for others still trapped in the darkness they had begun to escape. The road ahead would have its challenges. There would be bureaucracy to navigate, skeptics to convince, systems to change. But they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful patrol 3 years ago. Together, one step at a time, finding their way forward through the unique bond that had saved them both. In that moment, driving through the gathering twilight with Shadow vigilant beside him, Master Sergeant James Rhodes knew with absolute certainty that their greatest mission was just beginning. 3 months after the National Canine Excellence competition, the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Westbrook had transformed into something entirely new. The cavernous space that once housed manufacturing equipment now echoed with the sounds of dedicated work, trainers giving instructions, dogs responding to commands, and veterans finding new purpose in unexpected partnerships. A freshly painted sign hung above the entrance: Pathfinder K9, where warriors find their way home. Inside, the industrial ceiling had been fitted with skylights that bathed the training floor in natural illumination. One wall displayed the Ranger tab alongside the insignia of various military branches, while another featured before and after photographs of veterans and their service dogs. In the center of the main training area, Master Sergeant James Rhodes stood watching a practice session, Shadow vigilant at his side. The German Shepherd's attention alternated between monitoring his handler and observing the activity around them, a balanced awareness that the other dogs in training were gradually learning to emulate. "Torres is making excellent progress," Dr. Patricia Meadows noted, joining James as they observed a Marine veteran working with a Belgian Malinois. "His anxiety readings have decreased 30% since beginning the program." James nodded, watching as the former Marine guided his dog through a series of mobility assistance exercises. Carlos Torres had lost his right arm and suffered severe nerve damage to his left during his third deployment to Iraq. When he'd arrived at Pathfinder 8 weeks earlier, he could barely make eye contact and flinched at sudden movements. Now, his posture showed emerging confidence as he worked with his canine partner. "Valkyrie's natural alerting instincts are remarkable," James observed. "She picks up on his discomfort before he recognizes it himself." The Belgian Malinois had been scheduled for euthanasia at a county shelter when Michael Tanner, now Pathfinder's intake coordinator, had recognized her potential and brought her to James's attention. Beneath her fearful exterior, they had discovered an exceptional capacity for empathetic response, particularly to Torres's specific needs. "Your assessment was spot on," Dr. Meadows agreed. "Conventional programs would have rejected her for service work due to her shelter background, but she's outperforming dogs with traditional credentials." The unconventional approach to matching veterans with service dogs had become Pathfinder's hallmark. Rather than following the standard model of training dogs to a predetermined protocol and then pairing them with handlers, James had pioneered a system that identified each veteran's specific needs and each dog's natural capabilities, then built training around those unique combinations. "How's the research study progressing?" James asked, referring to the clinical trial Dr. Meadows had established to document Pathfinder's results. "The preliminary data is compelling. Veterans in our program are showing faster symptom reduction compared to traditional service dog placements." She consulted her tablet. "The VA is taking notice. They've requested a full presentation of our methodology next month." The mention of the Veterans Administration brought a complicated expression to James's face. The bureaucracy that had initially dismissed Pathfinder's approach was now cautiously acknowledging its effectiveness, opening doors for potential funding and wider implementation. "Director Coleman will be visiting tomorrow," Dr. Meadows added. "He wants to see firsthand what we're accomplishing here." James nodded, though tension gathered in his shoulders at the thought of hosting a high-ranking VA official. Shadow immediately pressed against his leg, providing the subtle pressure that helped regulate his stress response. The gesture wasn't lost on Dr. Meadows, who had been documenting Shadow's intuitive interventions as part of her research. "That's exactly what we need to demonstrate," she said, nodding toward Shadow's positioning. "Coleman needs to see these spontaneous responses, the adaptive support that makes your program different." "We'll be ready," James assured her, his hand dropping automatically to Shadow's head. As Dr. Meadows departed for her office, James continued his circuit around the training floor. In various sections of the warehouse-turned-training center, veterans and dogs worked together under the guidance of specialized trainers. Some focused on mobility assistance, others on medical alert responses, still others on the complex trauma interventions that had been Shadow's most significant contribution to service dog methodology. Near the entrance, William Hastings was conducting an assessment of a newly arrived German Shepherd, a retired military working dog with an exceptional deployment record, but temperament issues that had made him unsuitable for adoption to a civilian family. "What do you think?" James asked, approaching after the session concluded. Hastings' expression was thoughtful as he reviewed his notes. "Ranger has extraordinary capabilities: scent discrimination, tactical positioning, environmental assessment, but his responses are still locked in combat protocols. He needs to learn that civilians aren't potential threats." The once skeptical competition judge had become one of Pathfinder's strongest allies. After witnessing Shadow's performance at the showcase, Hastings had approached James with a proposition, a partnership that combined Hastings's technical expertise in training with James's innovative approach to handler-dog connection. 3 months later, that partnership had evolved into Pathfinder, a program specifically designed for veterans with PTSD, TBI, and combat-related physical disabilities. "Torres might be a good match for him," James suggested. "Former Force Recon. He understands the military mindset, knows how to transition from combat to civilian frameworks." Hastings considered this, watching as Torres completed his session with Valkyrie. "It's worth exploring. We'll run some interaction assessments tomorrow." The collaborative dynamic between James and Hastings remained a source of amazement to those who had witnessed their first meeting at the competition. Where Hastings had once dismissed Shadow's capabilities as inferior to professionally trained service dogs, he now studied the German Shepherd's methods with the humility of a master craftsman discovering a new technique. In return, James had come to appreciate the technical precision Hastings brought to their program, creating structured frameworks that made Shadow's intuitive responses teachable to other handler dog teams. "Rebecca called," Hastings added. "The school demonstration went exceptionally well. Hannah's presentation on service dogs for veterans apparently had the entire 5th grade captivated." James smiled at the mention of the Tanner family. Michael. Tanner had joined Pathfinder first as a participant, then as a volunteer, and finally as a full-time staff member coordinating veteran intake and initial assessments. His wife Rebecca managed community outreach, while their daughter Hannah had become an unofficial ambassador, educating her classmates about service dogs through school presentations. "She's quite the advocate," James acknowledged. "Future director material." As evening approached, most of the veterans and trainers departed, leaving the warehouse quieter, but not empty. In a corner converted to residential space, 4 veterans, in the intensive phase of the program, remained with their dogs, living on site during the critical bonding period. James completed a final check of the facility, ensuring security systems were activated and overnight staff were in position. Shadow walked beside him, maintaining the perfect heel position that had become second nature through years of partnership. In his office, a modest space with windows overlooking the training floor, James settled behind his desk to review the next day's schedule. The visit from VA Director Coleman would require careful preparation, not just of demonstrations, but of data and documentation. Dr. Meadows had prepared extensive research findings, but James knew that the most compelling evidence would be the veterans themselves, their progress, their renewed confidence, their testimonials about what their service dogs had helped them accomplish. Shadow lay across James's feet, providing the grounding pressure that had become an essential part of their evening routine. The weight helped regulate James's nervous system as he processed the day's events and prepared for tomorrow's challenges. A knock at the door interrupted his review of Coleman's background file. Michael Tanner stood in the doorway, his service dog, Maverick, a calm Labrador Retriever mix, at his side. "Got a minute?" Michael asked. "Of course." James gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Everything okay with the new intake assessments?" Michael sat, Maverick settling beside him with the relaxed vigilance that characterized Pathfinder-trained dogs. "The assessments are fine. It's about Coleman's visit tomorrow." James raised an eyebrow, waiting for Michael to continue. "I've been doing some research," Michael explained. "Coleman isn't just coming to observe. Word is, he's evaluating Pathfinder for potential VA certification and significant funding." This wasn't entirely surprising. The VA had been showing increasing interest in Pathfinder's results, particularly the shortened training time and higher success rates compared to traditional service dog programs. "That explains the entourage he's bringing," James noted. 6 staff members seems excessive for a simple observation. Michael nodded. "There's more. Coleman's son was 10th Mountain Division, wounded in Kandahar 3 years ago. Left leg amputation. Severe PTSD. He's been on the waiting list for a service dog through the VA's approved program for 18 months. The information shifted James's perspective on tomorrow's visit. Coleman wasn't just a bureaucrat evaluating a program. He was a father whose son was struggling with the same challenges that Pathfinder's veterans faced every day. "How did you learn this?" James asked. Michael gave a small smile. "Rebecca has her sources. She thought you should know. Might help tailor tomorrow's presentation." After Michael left, James sat in contemplative silence, Shadow still maintaining pressure. Across his feet, the stakes for tomorrow's visit had just increased significantly. VA certification would mean not only funding, but legitimacy, official recognition that Pathfinder's unconventional methods deserved a place alongside traditional service dog programs. It would also mean access to the hundreds of veterans currently languishing on waiting lists, many of whom might not survive the 2-year wait for conventionally trained service dogs. The thought tightened James's chest, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down. Shadow sensed the change immediately. The German Shepherd rose and placed his head on James's knee, amber eyes focused intently on his handler's face. The simple connection, dog to human, survivor to survivor, provided more comfort than any words could offer. "I know, boy," James murmured. "One mission at a time." Morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. James had spent the night in his on-site quarters, a modest apartment adjacent to the training center that he used when preparation for important events required late nights and early mornings. Shadow had slept at the foot of his bed, as always, his steady presence keeping the nightmares at bay. By 0600, they were already on the training floor, James in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt rather than his usual casual training clothes. A concession to the formality of the occasion, though he had stopped short of the tie that Hastings had suggested. The VA delegation was scheduled to arrive at 0900, but James believed in the military principle of being ready 2 hours early, rather than 1 minute late. He and Shadow methodically checked each station of the training center, ensuring everything was prepared for the demonstrations planned throughout the day. "Looking sharp, Sarge," Carlos Torres called as he entered, Valkyrie trotting beside him. Like James, the former Marine had dressed more formally than usual, his prosthetic arm visible below his rolled sleeve. "Ready for the brass?" "Always," James replied with a slight smile. "How's Valkyrie doing with the crowd anxiety protocols?" Torres reached down to stroke the Belgian Malinois' head. "Getting better every day. We worked the shopping mall yesterday, made it through 20 minutes before she signaled it was time to leave. That's 10 minutes longer than last week." This incremental progress defined success at Pathfinder. Not miraculous transformations, but steady, measurable improvements in functionality and quality of life. Each veteran moved at their own pace, supported by a dog specifically matched to their needs and challenges. By 0830, the training center had filled with staff, volunteers, and veteran participants. William Hastings arrived looking more formal than James had ever seen him, complete with tie and blazer. The transformation from competition judge to program co-founder still sometimes surprised James, though their partnership had proven remarkably effective. "Everything set for the demonstrations?" Hastings asked, surveying the training floor with a critical eye. "All ready," James confirmed. "Torres and Valkyrie will showcase mobility assistance, Mitchell and Ranger are handling the tactical transition demonstration, and the Tanners are coordinating the family integration segment." "And you and Shadow?" James nodded. "We'll handle the trauma response protocol. Dr. Meadows thinks it's our strongest evidence for the neurological benefits." At precisely 900, the security system announced the arrival of vehicles at the main gate. James and Hastings moved to the entrance, Shadow positioning himself perfectly at James's side. Together, they prepared to welcome the delegation that could determine Pathfinder's future. Director Robert Coleman proved to be a tall, imposing figure with the reserved demeanor of a career administrator. His entourage included clinical specialists, program evaluators, and budget analysts, each carrying tablets loaded with assessment, rubrics, and evaluation protocols. "Master Sergeant Rhodes," Coleman greeted him with a firm handshake. "Your program has generated significant interest at the VA. We're here to see if the results justify the attention." "We appreciate the opportunity." "Sir," James replied, with the deference to authority ingrained through years of military service. "We've prepared demonstrations of our core methodologies and outcomes." Coleman's gaze shifted to Shadow, studying the German Shepherd with unexpected recognition. "This is the dog from the showcase event. My assistant showed me the video." James nodded. "Shadow, sir. He's the foundation of our program model." "Impressive animal," Coleman acknowledged, then turned toward his team. "Let's see what they've built here." The evaluation began with Dr. Meadows presenting clinical data, the measurable improvements in participants' psychological and physiological markers, reduced anxiety levels, decreased medication dependence, improved sleep patterns, increased social engagement, all documented with the scientific rigor that the VA required. Following the presentation, James led the delegation on a tour of the facility, explaining how the former warehouse had been adapted for specialized training needs. The industrial space provided room for simulated environments, crowded urban settings, chaotic acoustic conditions, confined spaces, allowing veterans and dogs to practice coping strategies in controlled circumstances before facing real-world challenges. "The key innovation of Pathfinder," James explained as they walked, "is our recognition that service dogs can be taught to respond to individualized trauma patterns. Rather than training dogs to a standardized protocol, we identify each veteran's specific triggers and stress responses, then develop customized intervention techniques." Coleman listened attentively, occasionally making notes on his tablet. His expression remained neutral, offering no hint of his assessment. As they reached the main training floor, the delegation observed a series of demonstrations. Carlos Torres showcased how Valkyrie assisted with tasks his prosthetic arm couldn't manage, retrieving objects, opening doors, providing balance support when fatigue made his remaining arm unreliable. Throughout the demonstration, Valkyrie maintained awareness of Torres's anxiety levels, subtly repositioning herself whenever his stress indicators increased. Next, former Army Sergeant Kevin Mitchell demonstrated with Ranger how a military working dog could transition from battlefield protocols to civilian service. The German Shepherd, once reactive and aggressive in unfamiliar environments, now displayed discrimination between actual threats and harmless stimuli, maintaining protective positioning without inappropriate responses. Ranger came to us with extensive combat training, but couldn't adapt to civilian life, Hastings explained to Coleman. Traditional programs would have deemed him unsuitable for service work. Our approach identified his exceptional capabilities and channeled them appropriately. The Tanner family presentation proved particularly impactful. Michael, Rebecca, and Hannah demonstrated how Maverick had been integrated into their family structure, supporting not only Michael's PTSD management, but also strengthening family bonds disrupted by his post-deployment struggles. Before Maverick, Rebecca explained candidly, we were living with a stranger. Michael was physically present but emotionally unreachable. The hypervigilance, the nightmares, the emotional detachment, it was destroying our family. Michael nodded in agreement. I was surviving, not living. Maverick became the bridge between the soldier I was and the husband and father I needed to be. Hannah, now confident in front of the officials, explained how she had learned to recognize her father's triggers and support Maverick's assistance strategies. We're a team now, she concluded with the simple wisdom of a child. Dad, Maverick, Mom, me, and Sonny. Throughout the demonstrations, James observed Coleman closely, noting how the director's clinical detachment occasionally gave way to personal interest, particularly during the family presentation. There was something in Coleman's expression when Hannah spoke about reconnecting with her father, a flicker of emotion quickly masked by professional composure. Finally, it was time for James and Shadow to demonstrate the trauma response protocols that formed the core of Pathfinder's methodology. James led the delegation to a specialized area designed for PTSD intervention training. What you're about to see, he explained, is an authentic demonstration of how service dogs can respond to trauma triggers and interrupt escalation patterns. With Dr. Meadows' supervision, I'll allow myself to experience the early stages of a genuine PTSD episode, and Shadow will demonstrate his intervention techniques. Coleman looked skeptical. You can induce a PTSD response voluntarily. Dr. Meadows stepped forward. Master Sergeant Rhodes has developed remarkable self-awareness through his work with Shadow. He can access trigger states in a controlled manner, while maintaining sufficient executive function to prevent full dissociation. James moved to the center of the demonstration area, Shadow attentive beside him. For veterans with combat-related PTSD, certain stimuli can trigger autonomic nervous system responses, what's commonly called flashbacks or episodes. These responses typically follow predictable physiological patterns that trained dogs can detect and interrupt. With deliberate focus, James began the demonstration. He allowed his breathing to alter, becoming shallow and rapid. His posture stiffened, hands clenching slightly at his sides. To the observing delegation, these might have seemed like minor changes, but to Shadow they represented the earliest indicators of distress. The German Shepherd responded immediately, moving into a specific positioning that applied gentle pressure against James's left leg, the prosthetic side. When James's hand unconsciously moved toward his scar, Shadow intercepted the motion, nudging his arm down and redirecting his attention. As James allowed the symptoms to progress, Shadow's interventions became more active. The dog circled too. Face him directly, establishing eye contact and applying increased pressure. When James's breathing became more erratic, Shadow placed his paws on James's chest, creating firm pressure that helped regulate his autonomic nervous system. Throughout the demonstration, Dr. Meadows provided clinical commentary, explaining the neurological mechanisms behind each intervention. Shadow is essentially providing biofeedback, she explained. The pressure stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, counteracting the sympathetic dominance of the trauma response. The eye contact helps anchor the veteran in present reality rather than traumatic memory. When the demonstration concluded, James took a moment to center himself, Shadow maintaining contact until he was fully regulated. The delegation had watched in silence, their expressions ranging from clinical interest to genuine amazement. This is not a trained performance, James emphasized once he had recovered. Shadow developed these responses through observation and intuition. What makes our program unique is our ability to identify and cultivate these natural capabilities in other dogs, matching them with veterans whose specific trauma patterns they're best equipped to address. Coleman studied Shadow with new interest. How long did it take to develop these responses? Shadow began adapting his military working dog skills to my PTSD symptoms almost immediately after my injury, James explained. What took time was my recognition of what he was doing and my ability to cooperate with his interventions rather than resist them. And you believe this can be replicated with other dogs and veterans? Hastings stepped forward. Not exactly replicated. Each partnership is unique. But we've developed assessment methods to identify dogs with similar intuitive capabilities and training protocols to enhance their natural responses. After the demonstrations concluded, Coleman requested a private meeting with James, Hastings, and Dr. Meadows. In the conference room overlooking the training floor, the VA director's professional demeanor softened slightly. "What you've built here is impressive," Coleman acknowledged. "Your outcomes data is compelling, and the demonstrations were enlightening." "Thank you, sir," James replied. Coleman consulted his tablet briefly. "However, there are significant obstacles to VA certification. Your training time frame, 12 weeks versus the standard 18 to 24 months, raises questions about long-term efficacy. Your use of shelter dogs and retired military working dogs rather than purpose-bred animals contradicts established best practices. Your emphasis on intuitive response over standardized protocols makes quality control difficult to assess." The objections were familiar, the same resistance James had encountered since conceptualizing Pathfinder. The traditional service dog community had built its reputation on lengthy training periods and standardized methodologies. Pathfinder's approach challenged those foundations. "With respect, sir," James responded, "those perceived obstacles are actually our strengths. Our shortened time frame means veterans receive support when they need it most, not after months or years on waiting lists. Our use of shelter and retired working dogs provides second chances to animals with exceptional capabilities. And our emphasis on intuitive response produces partnerships tailored to each veteran's specific needs rather than generic capabilities that may not address their unique challenges." Coleman remained expressionless, but James sensed he was listening with genuine consideration. Dr. Meadows presented additional data, showing retention rates and longitudinal outcomes that supported Pathfinder's approach. Hastings outlined quality control measures and assessment protocols designed specifically for their methodology. As the meeting concluded, Coleman stood to leave, his final assessment still unclear. At the door, he paused, looking back at James with an expression that had shifted from clinical evaluation to something more personal. "My son, Captain Robert Coleman Jr., returned from Afghanistan 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Left leg amputation below the knee, severe PTSD, TBI. He's been on the VA's service dog waiting list for 18 months. The director's professional facade cracked slightly. He doesn't have another 6 months to wait." The admission transformed the dynamic in the room. This wasn't just about program certification or funding allocation. It was about a father watching his son struggle through the same challenges that James had faced, and finding hope in the possibility that Pathfinder might offer a faster path to healing. "We currently have 3 dogs in advanced training that might be suitable matches for your son's needs," James said carefully. "If he's willing to participate in our program evaluation study, we could begin assessment immediately." Coleman nodded, the simple gesture conveying both professional acknowledgement and personal gratitude. "I'll have his case file transferred to Dr. Meadows for review." After the delegation departed, James returned to the training floor, where the day's regular Activities had resumed. Shadow moved beside him, attuned as always to his handler's emotional state. The German shepherd sensed the complex mix of hope and caution that Coleman's visit had generated. "What do you think, boy?" James asked quietly. "Did we convince him?" Shadow's response was to press against his leg, providing the steady pressure that had become their private language of reassurance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as they had faced everything since that fateful patrol 3 years earlier. James looked out over the training floor, watching the veterans working with their dogs, each partnership unique, yet connected by the common thread of healing through mutual support. Torres laughing as Valkyrie performed a retrieval task with unexpected flair. Mitchell and Ranger navigating a complex obstacle course with synchronized movements. The Tanner family planning their next community presentation. 3 months ago, none of this had existed. 3 months ago, James had been a solitary veteran with an extraordinary dog, navigating his own recovery in isolation. Now, he stood at the center of something larger, a community of warriors finding their way home through the unique bond between handler and dog. The path forward remained uncertain. Coleman's support wasn't guaranteed. The VA's bureaucracy wouldn't transform overnight. The traditional service dog community would continue to question Pathfinder's methods. But standing amid the tangible evidence of what they had already accomplished, James felt something he hadn't experienced since before the IED that had changed his life. Genuine confidence in the future. Shadow nudged his hand, drawing his attention back to the present moment. A gentle reminder from the partner who had pulled him from the darkness that dwelling too long on either past or future could distract from the work at hand. "You're right," James acknowledged, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "One mission at a time." Together they returned to the training floor, ready to continue building a new kind of service, not on battlefields against enemy combatants, but in the equally crucial territory of trauma recovery and renewed purpose. The war might be over, but for these veterans and their extraordinary dogs, the most important victories still lay ahead. 1 year after VA Director Coleman's pivotal visit to Pathfinder K9, the transformed warehouse had expanded to include a second building. The original training center now operated at full capacity, while the adjacent structure housed administrative offices, research facilities, and a specialized medical clinic designed specifically for the needs of veterans and their service dogs. Master Sergeant James Rhodes stood at the large window overlooking the main training floor, watching as 20 handler dog teams moved through their morning exercises. Shadow remained at his side, the German shepherd's muzzle now showing touches of grey that matched the silver threading through James's hair. They had both aged during the intense year of growth and challenges, but their partnership had only deepened with time. "The congressional delegation has arrived," Dr. Patricia Meadows announced, joining James at the window. "Their motorcade just cleared security." James nodded, straightening the collar of his dress shirt, a concession to the formality of today's event. "How's Captain Coleman doing with the presentation prep?" "Remarkably calm," Dr. Meadows replied with a smile. "Atlas hasn't left his side all morning." The mention of Captain Robert Coleman Jr. and his service dog brought a flicker of pride. To James's face, the VA director's son had become Pathfinder's most compelling success story and its most effective advocate. Once withdrawn and struggling, the former Army captain now served as Pathfinder's Director of Government Relations, using his personal experience and family connections to navigate the labyrinthine world of federal funding and policy. His partnership with Atlas, a Belgian Malinois with exceptional intuitive capabilities, had become the centerpiece of Pathfinder's presentations to officials. The dramatic improvement in Captain Coleman's psychological and physical functioning provided irrefutable evidence of the program's effectiveness, silencing even the most skeptical critics. The National Expansion Initiative isn't just about funding, James reflected, watching a new veteran working through mobility exercises with his recently matched German Shepherd. It's about changing the entire approach to service dog placement for veterans. Dr. Meadows nodded in agreement. From 24 months to 12 weeks, from standardized training to individualized matching, from 300 placements annually to potentially thousands. The scale of what they were proposing still sometimes overwhelmed James. What had begun as a personal journey of recovery with Shadow had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined that day at the National Canine Excellence Competition, when whispers and judgment had nearly convinced him to withdraw before their demonstration. Master Sergeant? Eliza Montgomery appeared at the office door, tablet in hand. Once the skeptical competition coordinator, she had joined Pathfinder 6 months earlier as Program Development Director, bringing her organizational expertise and industry connections to their rapidly expanding operation. "Time to head downstairs," she advised. "William wants to review the demonstration sequence once more before the delegation arrives." James and Shadow followed Eliza to the elevator, descending to the main floor where final preparations were underway for the congressional presentation. Staff members adjusted lighting, checked audiovisual equipment, and positioned chairs for the distinguished visitors who would determine Pathfinder's future. William Hastings supervised the activity with characteristically meticulous attention to detail. The former competition judge had transformed as much as the program itself over the past year, trading his emphasis on rigid protocols for a more balanced approach that combined technical precision with intuitive response. His expertise had been crucial in translating Pathfinder's innovative methods into standardized procedures that could be replicated across multiple locations. "James," Hastings greeted him, clipboard in hand. "I've adjusted the demonstration order. We'll open with Torres and Valkyrie for mobility assistance, then transition to the Tanners for family integration. Captain Coleman and Atlas will handle the PTSD response protocol, followed by Mitchell and Ranger for the tactical transition segment." James noted his own absence from the lineup. "Shadow and I aren't demonstrating." Hastings smiled slightly. "You and Shadow are our closing statement. No rehearsed demonstration, just your story, from that first day at the competition to where we are now, the human element that pulls everything together." The approach made sense. Technical demonstrations would showcase Pathfinder's methodology, but the program's true power lay in the transformative journeys of its participants, starting with James and Shadow. As they reviewed final details, James noticed Carlos Torres, entering with Valkyrie. The former Marine's transformation remained one of Pathfinder's most remarkable success stories. When he'd first arrived, his severe nerve damage had left him unable to perform basic daily tasks, while his combat trauma had made social interaction nearly impossible. Now he moved with confidence, Valkyrie attentive at his side, his prosthetic, arm customized for enhanced functionality with the Belgian Malinois' assistance. "Morning, Sarge." Torres greeted him with a smile that would have been unimaginable a year earlier, ready for the congressional dog and pony show. "As ready as we'll ever be," James replied. "How's Valkyrie handling the activity level this morning?" Torres glanced down at his service dog. "Rock solid. We did a practice run through the stimulation chamber yesterday. Full crowd noise, unexpected movements, the works. She didn't miss a beat." The stimulation chamber, a training environment that mimicked challenging real-world scenarios, had been Hastings's innovation, allowing handler dog teams to practice responses to potential triggers in a controlled setting before facing them. In public, The facility had proven invaluable for gradually building confidence and resilience, particularly for veterans with severe anxiety or hypervigilance. Master Sergeant Rhodes? A security team member approached with an urgent expression. We have a situation at the main gate. A woman is insisting on speaking with you, says it's regarding Shadow. She doesn't have clearance, but she's quite persistent. James exchanged a concerned glance with Hastings. With the congressional delegation arriving imminently, security protocols were at their highest level. Unscheduled visitors weren't permitted on the grounds. Did she identify herself? James asked. Lieutenant Commander Diane Reeves, Navy, the security officer replied. She showed military ID, says it's about Shadow's history before you found him. The name meant nothing to James, but the mention of Shadow's pre-rescue history immediately captured his attention. In the years since finding Shadow wounded after the IED attack, James had never uncovered details about the German Shepherd's life before their deployment together. Military working dogs had records, of course, but Shadow's file had contained significant gaps, with his early training history notably absent. I'll meet her at the security office, James decided. Shadow with me. Hastings looked concerned. The delegation will be here in 30 minutes. We'll be back in 20, James assured him, already moving toward the security wing. Shadow, at perfect heel position beside him. In the security office adjacent to the main gate, James found a woman in her early 40s wearing a Navy uniform with the insignia of a lieutenant commander. Her posture was military precise as she stood, waiting, but her expression softened immediately when Shadow entered the room. Master Sergeant Rhodes, she greeted him formally. Thank you for seeing me, especially today. I know the congressional delegation is expected shortly. Lieutenant Commander Reeves, James acknowledged with equal formality. You mentioned information about Shadow. She nodded, her gaze shifting to the German Shepherd, who watched her with alert interest. May I? She asked, gesturing toward Shadow. James gave a slight nod, and Shadow remained steady as the naval officer knelt to examine him more closely. Her fingers gently traced the scar along his flank, the permanent reminder of the shrapnel that had nearly taken his life while saving James. It is him, she said softly, standing again. I recognized him from the news coverage of Pathfinder, but I needed to be certain. Recognized him from where, Commander? James asked, his protective instincts heightened. Diane Reeves reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a photograph, extending it toward James. From Operation Midnight, Naval Special Warfare K-9 Training Program 2015. James accepted the photograph, studying it carefully. The image showed a younger Diane Reeves in training gear, surrounded by 4 German Shepherd puppies. One puppy, slightly larger than the others with distinctive markings around his muzzle, was unmistakably Shadow. Shadow was born into the Navy's Experimental Tactical Response Breeding Program, Reeves explained. I was his initial trainer. We were developing enhanced intuitive response protocols, training dogs to anticipate handler needs without verbal or visual commands. James looked up from the photograph, absorbing this unexpected revelation. But Shadow's military records show him entering Army service through standard channels. Reeves's expression tightened slightly. That's why I'm here. The Navy program was classified and officially terminated after 2 years due to budget constraints. The dogs were supposed to be redistributed through conventional military working dog pipelines, their special training undocumented. But you're saying Shadow had specialized training before he came to the Rangers? James tried to reconcile this new information with what he knew of Shadow's capabilities. Not exactly training, Reeves clarified. Selection. We were identifying dogs with natural intuitive capabilities and enhancing those traits through specialized socialization. Shadow, we called him Echo then, displayed exceptional empathetic response patterns from 8 weeks old. He could detect subtle physiological changes in handlers and adapt his behavior accordingly. The explanation suddenly illuminated so much about Shadow's unusual abilities. The way he had intuitively responded to James's PTSD symptoms without specific training, his capacity to anticipate needs before they were expressed, his extraordinary sensitivity to emotional states. "Why are you telling me this now?" James asked, though he suspected the answer given the timing of her visit. "Because what you've built with Pathfinder validates everything we were trying to prove with the original program," Reeves replied. "That dogs with enhanced intuitive capabilities can provide support that goes beyond conventional service dog protocols, particularly for trauma recovery." She gestured toward the window, where security vehicles were escorting the congressional motorcade through the main gate. "Those officials are here to evaluate expanding Pathfinder nationwide. I believe they should know that Shadow's capabilities aren't just a happy accident or the result of your specific bond, though that's certainly part of it. They represent the outcome of a deliberately developed approach to canine selection that could be replicated systematically." James absorbed this information, watching Shadow, who had remained attentive throughout the conversation. The revelation that Shadow's extraordinary abilities had roots in a specialized breeding program didn't diminish the uniqueness of their partnership, but it did suggest possibilities for identifying other dogs with similar potential. A scientific foundation for what had seemed intuitive art. "The congressional delegation is expecting a presentation on our methodology in 15 minutes, James said finally. "I think they should hear your perspective as well, Commander." Reeves straightened. "That's why I'm here, Sergeant, to help ensure that what you've built has the strongest possible foundation for expansion." With Shadow leading the way, James escorted Commander Reeves back to the main training floor, where the final preparations for the congressional presentation were concluding. He quickly briefed Hastings and Dr. Meadows on the unexpected development, watching their expressions shift from concern to fascination as they grasped the implications. "This could provide the scientific underpinning the VA has been demanding," Dr. Meadows observed, "already considering how to incorporate this new information into their research protocols, and explain why certain dogs in our program show stronger intuitive capabilities than others," Hastings added, his trainer's mind immediately connecting dots between Shadow's background and the varying success rates they'd observed in different canine candidates. Before they could discuss further, the main doors opened and the congressional delegation entered. 5 representatives and 3 senators, accompanied by staffers and VA officials, including Director Coleman. Captain Coleman Jr. and Atlas greeted the officials, beginning the carefully orchestrated welcome that would transition into the formal presentation. As the delegation took their seats, James felt a momentary tightening in his chest, the familiar pressure of high stakes, moments that had once triggered his PTSD symptoms. Shadow immediately pressed against his leg, providing the grounding contact that helped regulate his nervous system. The simple gesture reminded James of how far they had come together, from those early days of overwhelming panic to this new capacity for managed stress. The presentation began with Dr. Meadows outlining Pathfinder's clinical outcomes, the measurable improvements in veterans' psychological and physiological markers, the reduced medication dependence, the increased functional capacity. Her scientific precision established the empirical foundation for what would follow. Carlos Torres and Valkyrie demonstrated mobility assistance techniques, showcasing how the Belgian Malinois had been specifically trained to accommodate the unique challenges of Torres's nerve damage and prosthetic arm. The former Marine spoke candidly about his journey from isolation to renewed purpose, crediting Valkyrie with providing not just physical support, but a reason to engage with the world again. The Tanner family presentation focused on family reintegration, with Michael, Rebecca, and Hannah explaining how service dog support extended beyond the individual veteran to strengthen entire family systems disrupted by combat trauma. 11-year-old Hannah's confident articulation of how Maverick had given her dad back to her visibly moved several congressional representatives. Captain Coleman and Atlas demonstrated the PTSD response protocols that formed Pathfinder's core methodology. With professional precision, the former Army officer allowed himself to display early symptoms of anxiety, which Atlas immediately detected and addressed through graduated interventions. Throughout the demonstration, Captain Coleman provided commentary on the neurological mechanisms behind each response, combining personal experience with scientific understanding. The final technical demonstration featured Kevin Mitchell and Ranger, showcasing how military working dogs with combat experience could be transitioned to civilian service roles. The German Shepherd, once considered too aggressive for adoption, now demonstrated precise discrimination between actual threats and benign stimuli, maintaining protective positioning without inappropriate reactivity. Throughout these presentations, James observed the congressional delegation's responses, noting their transition from polite interest to genuine engagement. The empirical data provided credibility, but it was the personal narratives and live demonstrations that clearly resonated most deeply. When the technical presentations concluded, Hastings introduced James and Shadow as Pathfinder's founders, inviting them to share the journey that had inspired the program. As James moved to the center of the training floor, Shadow at perfect heel position beside him, he felt a moment of clarity about how to incorporate Commander Reeves's revelations into their story. "Shadow and I met in Afghanistan," James began, his voice steady and clear. "We conducted over 200 combat missions together with the 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 years ago, an IED detonated during a patrol near the Pakistan border. I lost my left leg below the knee and sustained traumatic brain injury. Shadow suffered shrapnel wounds while dragging me to safety under enemy fire." The familiar introduction established their shared background of service and sacrifice. James continued, describing their journey through medical evacuation, hospitalization, and the early stages of recovery. "What I didn't understand then," he explained, "was why Shadow began developing responses to my PTSD symptoms without specific training, how he learned to interrupt nightmares, provide pressure therapy during anxiety attacks, create space in crowded environments, and stabilize my gait when balance issues from TBI affected my mobility." James gestured toward Commander Reeves, who stood at the side of the training area. "Today, just before your arrival, I learned that Shadow, known then as Echo, was born into a specialized naval special warfare breeding program focused on enhanced intuitive response. He was specifically selected for his natural empathetic capabilities before entering conventional military working dog service." The revelation clearly surprised the delegation, several members leaning forward with increased interest as commander. Reeves stepped forward to briefly explain the classified program that had identified and enhanced Shadow's natural abilities. "This discovery doesn't diminish the unique bond Shadow and I developed," James continued, "but it does suggest that what we've built with Pathfinder isn't just a fortunate accident. It's the rediscovery and expansion of an approach to canine selection and training that recognizes dogs' natural capacity for intuitive response, particularly to trauma and recovery." James moved to the center of the training area, focusing now on the transformation from personal recovery to program development. "A year ago, Shadow and I entered the National Canine Excellence Competition. We weren't welcomed. A veteran with obvious disabilities and a battle-scarred military dog didn't fit the polished image of service dog showcases. He described that pivotal day, the skepticism they'd faced, the demonstration that had silenced critics, and the unexpected crisis that had proven Shadow's capabilities beyond any rehearsed performance. That day changed everything, James explained. It showed us that what Shadow and I had developed wasn't just for us. It could be systematized, taught, expanded, not to replace traditional service dog methodologies, but to complement them with approaches specifically suited to combat veterans' unique needs. Shadow remained positioned perfectly beside James throughout this narrative, occasionally making subtle adjustments to maintain contact when James's voice or posture indicated increasing emotion. These spontaneous responses provided living demonstration of everything James described, more powerful than any rehearsed performance could have been. What began with one dog and one veteran has expanded to 75 partnerships across Pathfinder's program, James continued. With your support for the National Expansion Initiative, we can extend this approach to veterans in every state, reducing wait times from years to months and providing specifically tailored support rather than generalized assistance. James concluded by addressing the fundamental question that had brought the congressional delegation to Pathfinder. Is this approach scalable? With Commander Reeves's insights into selecting dogs with natural intuitive capabilities, Dr. Meadows's research on measuring and enhancing those traits, and the training protocols we've developed here, the answer is unequivocally yes. When James finished speaking, the training floor remained silent for several moments. Then Senator Elizabeth Hargrove, the delegation leader, rose from her seat. Master Sergeant Rhodes, she began, her expression thoughtful. I've visited numerous veteran support programs during my tenure on the Armed Services Committee. What you've built here is unlike anything I've encountered, not just in its outcomes, but in its fundamental approach to healing. She turned to address her colleagues. The veterans' waiting list for service dogs currently exceeds 10,000, with average wait times of 18 to 24 months. During that wait, we lose 22 veterans daily to suicide. If Pathfinder's approach can safely reduce training time while maintaining or improving efficacy, scaling this program becomes not just an opportunity, but an obligation. One by one, other delegation members added their observations and questions. The discussion evolved from whether to support Pathfinder's expansion to how best to implement it. Questions of infrastructure, training facilities, canine selection criteria, and quality control across multiple locations. Throughout this discussion, James stood with Shadow, occasionally contributing specific details, but primarily allowing the program's results to speak for themselves. The German Shepherd remained focused and vigilant, his occasional adjustments, in response to James's subtle stress cues, providing ongoing demonstration of the intuitive capabilities they were discussing. As the formal presentation concluded and the delegation prepared to tour additional facilities, Senator Hargrove approached James privately. My nephew returned from his third deployment last year, she said quietly. He's struggling, won't leave his apartment, can't sleep, pushing everyone away. Traditional therapies haven't helped. She glanced down at Shadow, then back to James. Would your program consider him, not as a congressional favor, but as a veteran who needs what you've built here? We consider every veteran who seeks help, Senator, James replied simply. Have him contact Michael Tanner, our intake coordinator. We'll assess his needs and potential matches just like any other applicant. The senator nodded, genuine gratitude replacing her usual political composure. Thank you, Master Sergeant, for your service then and for your service now. As the delegation continued their tour with Hastings and Dr. Meadows, James took a moment to step outside, needing a brief respite from the intensity of the presentation. Shadow accompanied him to a quiet courtyard where veterans and dogs often trained in good weather. Commander Reeves found them there a few minutes later, respectfully waiting to be acknowledged before approaching. "Your presentation was compelling, Sergeant. I think you convinced them." James nodded, studying the naval officer who had provided the missing piece of Shadow's history. "Why was the original program really shut down, Commander? Budget constraints." "Seem convenient." Reeves's expression tightened slightly. "Politics. Some officials believed enhanced intuitive response was too difficult to standardize, too dependent on individual dogs' natural capabilities rather than reliable training protocols. They preferred approaches that could be systematically replicated with any suitable dog. The same criticism Pathfinder faced initially, James observed. Exactly. But you've proven what we theorized, that while not every dog has these capabilities, those that do can be identified early and their natural tendencies enhanced through specialized training. She glanced at Shadow with evident pride. Echo, Shadow was our most promising candidate. Seeing what he's become, what you've built together, validates everything we were working toward. James considered this, recognizing that Shadow's extraordinary abilities weren't simply a miracle of circumstance, but the result of both natural genetics and deliberate early development, combined with the profound bond they had formed through shared trauma and recovery. "Will you consider joining us?" he asked finally. "Pathfinder will need expertise in identifying puppies with the right intuitive capabilities if we're going to scale nationally." Commander Reeves straightened slightly, surprised by the offer. "I'm still active duty, Sergeant." "So was I once," James replied. "Sometimes we find our most important missions outside the uniform." Before she could respond, Eliza appeared at the courtyard entrance. "James, they're calling for you. The delegation is ready to announce their preliminary decision." Inside, the congressional representatives had reconvened in the main training area. The assembled staff of Pathfinder, veterans, trainers, researchers, and support personnel gathered to hear the delegation's determination. Every handler dog team stood at attention, a visual representation of the program's impact. Senator Hargrove addressed the gathering, her experienced political voice projecting clearly through the space. After reviewing Pathfinder's methodology, outcomes data, and demonstration capabilities, the Joint Congressional Delegation unanimously recommends full funding for the National Expansion Initiative. A murmur of excitement passed through the assembled staff, quickly quieted as the senator continued. "Furthermore, we will be introducing legislation to establish Pathfinder's protocols as an officially sanctioned alternative to traditional service dog programs within the VA system, with equivalent funding and support." The announcement triggered spontaneous applause, relief, and validation, washing over those who had worked tirelessly to build Pathfinder from its humble beginnings. Captain Coleman embraced his father, the VA director's usual professional reserve. Giving way to genuine emotion, the Tanner family huddled together, Michael lifting Hannah onto his shoulders in celebration. Torres and Mitchell exchanged the fist bump that had become their signature recognition of progress achieved. James remained centered in the moment, acknowledging the announcement with a respectful nod, while Shadow maintained his perfect positioning, the unshakable partnership that had started everything. As the formal proceedings concluded and staff members began celebrating, Hastings approached James, uncharacteristic emotion evident in his expression. "When you first walked into that exhibition ring a year ago, I thought you were out of place," he admitted. "I couldn't have been more wrong." "We were all finding our way," James replied. "Still are." Director Coleman joined them, extending his hand to James. "My son arrived at Pathfinder unable to function in basic social settings. Today, he presented to a congressional delegation with more composure than most of my career officials." That transformation is why this program deserves national implementation. As conversations continued around them, James found a moment of quiet reflection, Shadow still vigilant beside him. From the wounded veteran who had once wondered if he should even enter a dog competition, to the program director now entrusted with expanding Pathfinder nationwide, the journey seemed almost unimaginable. Yet here they stood, surrounded by the living evidence of what was possible when pain became purpose, when trauma became transformation, when one partnership expanded to create healing for many. That evening, after the officials had departed and the celebration had quieted, James returned to his office to process the day's developments. Shadow settled across his feet, providing the grounding pressure that remained essential to James's well-being, even as other PTSD symptoms had diminished. On his desk sat a framed photograph, not of military honors or program achievements, but of that first moment in the exhibition ring when whispers and judgment had nearly convinced him to withdraw. The image captured James and Shadow standing, tall, despite the skepticism surrounding them, preparing to demonstrate a partnership that would ultimately change the landscape of veteran support. Beside this photograph now sat Commander Reeves's image of Shadow as a puppy, a visual reminder that even the most transformative journeys have humble beginnings, that potential exists before it's recognized, that purpose often emerges from unexpected sources. As James reviewed initial plans for Pathfinder's national expansion, Shadow shifted position, placing his head on James's knee and looking up with the unwavering focus that had been their constant communication channel through years of challenge and change. "I know, boy," James said quietly, understanding Shadow's silent reminder to remain present rather than becoming overwhelmed by future complexities. One mission at a time. The German Shepherd's response was to press closer, the simple physical connection that had guided them from battlefield to hospital room, from isolation to community, from personal healing to national impact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: scaling, methodologies, establishing regional centers, training new staff, identifying suitable dogs. The path ahead contained complexities they had yet to navigate. But for tonight, it was enough to acknowledge how far they had come from that moment of humiliation at the dog showcase, and how many lives would be transformed because they had found the courage to continue despite judgment and doubt. In the quiet of his office, with Shadow's steady presence anchoring him to the present moment, Master Sergeant James Rhodes allowed himself to feel something that had once seemed impossible in the aftermath of catastrophic injury and trauma. Genuine hope for the future, not just for himself and Shadow, but for thousands of veterans who would find their own paths to healing through the doorway they had opened. The exhibition judges, who had once viewed them with skepticism, could never have imagined that the battle-scarred veteran and his wounded military dog would create a national movement. The professionals who had dismissed Shadow's intuitive responses as inferior to standardized training could never have foreseen how that approach would revolutionize service dog methodology for combat veterans. But Shadow had known, had recognized James's worth when he couldn't see it himself, had guided him through darkness toward renewed purpose, had demonstrated that the deepest healing sometimes comes through helping others find their way back. From similar wounds, as darkness settled over Pathfinder's campus, lights dimmed except for security illumination, James and Shadow finally headed toward their quarters. They walked side by side as they had for years, through combat zones and hospital corridors, through panic attacks and public scrutiny, through personal recovery and program development. Tomorrow they would begin building Pathfinder's national future. Tonight they walked together as they always had, two warriors who had found their greatest purpose, not in battlefield victory, but in the quieter, more profound triumph of healing, transformed into hope for others. And in that journey from humiliation to impact, from judgment to validation, from isolation to community, lay a truth that extended far beyond service dogs or veteran programs. That our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to others. That purpose often emerges from pain, and that sometimes the path forward becomes clear only when we find the courage to continue despite doubt, both external and internal. For James Rhodes and Shadow, what had begun as a desperate search for recovery had evolved into something far greater than either could have imagined. And as they moved forward into Pathfinder's expanding future, they carried with them the certainty that had sustained them from the beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, one step at a time, finding their way forward through the unique bond that had saved them both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.